Thank you for coming today. I'm Pat Heim, and today we're going to be talking about managing conflict. When I do conflict workshops, I often ask people ahead of time, what is it that you'd like to get out of this workshop today? And one of the frequent things I'm asked for is, I'd like to get rid of conflict in my life. Now, one of the things I can promise this person is I know the day that you will get rid of conflict in your life. And when is that day? Yeah, the day you leave this planet. So one of the things that we can actually bank on is having conflict. Today we're going to be talking about managing conflict in a productive way, because what often happens with conflict is it ends up being destructive and damaging the relationship, and then we shy away from it and the conflict doesn't go away. You know, oftentimes when I'm doing team building, one of the great ironies in my mind about team building is the way a team becomes cohesive is through conflict. Now that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense overtly, but here's what happens, whether the team is 2 people or a group of people, is if I have to be nicey to Karen because I might offend her, and so I just always say things that I really don't mean, then what will happen is I'll never feel cohesive with Karen. Because here's what happens. If I can say to her, you know, the example is your very best friend in the whole world. If you can, that is somebody to whom you can say anything. And the fact that you can say anything to them is why you feel so cohesive with them. And it isn't necessarily that Karen will agree with me, but she'll try to understand it from my perspective. And so today, in talking about conflict, we're going to be talking about conflict in a way that increases cohesiveness and helps the relationship rather than damages the relationship. Now, there's also, in some of the strategies that we're going to be talking about, there's also a gender trend. That is, if you think about the kinds of games that boys grow up playing, they grow up playing basketball, baseball, football, cops, robbers, cowboys, and Indians, and war, all of which are team sports. And one of the things that's common to team sports is they are all competitive. It's me against you. It's us against them. And if you think about it, another term for competition is conflict. Boys grow up relating to other people through conflict. Girls grow up, on the other hand, tending to play one-on-one. And typically with my best friend. Kathy's my best friend. She can't be your best friend. And therefore, one of the things that's very important to girls is to avoid conflict because it could potentially damage the relationship. I mean, let me ask the women here. How many times as a kid do you suppose you were told to get along and be nice? Can you even fathom how many times you were told that? These are code words for do not get into any conflict. Therefore, in adulthood, men and women often manage conflict very differently. We'll be talking about some of the ways that we manage it differently. So let's talk about some of the basic strategies for managing conflict. One of them, and in my mind, the overarching strategy, is to avoid defensiveness. That is probably the most critical thing in managing conflict, is to avoid defensiveness, both on my part, if I'm the one who is, for instance, getting attacked, and on their part. Because if that other person becomes defensive, I'm going to end up spending 90% of my time trying to get around the defensiveness rather than dealing with the issue at hand. So here's a scenario. Imagine here I am in my office working away, and somebody comes into me and says, Pat, you're supposed to have that information due by 2 o'clock. I had to go to the meeting without it. As a result, everybody jumped on my case. I looked like a fool. Now, and let's say what happened is that I was going to get that information to that person by 2 o'clock, but at the last minute, my boss came in with a hot assignment from the CEO, gave it to me, I had to do it, and I didn't have any choice if I wanted to keep my job. So let's say that that's the scenario. Here is our natural tendency. Since we human beings, one of the things I believe about we human beings, basic premise in my mind, is that we human beings do things for reasons that make sense to us. Okay? Therefore, here's my natural tendency. This person is attacking me. They attack, so I defend. What are they now more likely to do? Attack even more. So I have to defend more. So they attack more. So I defend more. So what I am doing by defending myself, what I'm doing, without realizing it, is I am feeding the conflict. So instead of defending, what I need to do is to zip the lip and listen. Because the next step that I need to do is to actively listen. Now, what does actively listen mean? It means I have to get behind his eyeballs. I have to understand how this situation looks from Bill's perspective. Now, that's easy to say, but what happens is somebody's coming at you, we want to tell them, you know, it made perfect sense for me to do what I did. And if I'm defending myself, I am not hearing what he has to say, because this back here, this is what I have to manage in the conflict. And once I understand how this looks to him and feels to him, now I can go to the next step, which is to paraphrase the conflict from his perspective. So let's say he was the person that came in and was jumping on my case because I didn't get that information to him by 2 o'clock. So I said to him, okay, Bill, okay, as I understand it, what happened was, because I didn't get the information to you at 2 o'clock, you had to go to that meeting without it. Everybody jumped on your case and you felt like a fool. Is that what happened? Now, next step is to legitimize. And that is to go back and say, you know, Bill, if I were in your shoes, I'd probably be ticked off too. Now, let me talk about the 2 things I just did. One is I paraphrase. Now, why would you paraphrase? Because what happens instead, if we don't paraphrase, is we tell the person, we're trying to tell the person, I heard what you have to say. Bill, I heard you, I understand, Bill. Yes, Bill, I understand. But what happens is he doesn't really think I understand. Or if I understand the facts, he thinks I don't really understand the drama of it. And therefore, by paraphrasing back to him, what I have done is I have proven to him that I have listened. And then the legitimizing part. You know, Bill, if I were in your shoes, I'd probably feel the same way that you do. Now, here's what I want to point out to you about legitimizing. It is not saying that you're right and I'm wrong. It is instead saying, if the world looked to me this way, I would probably feel the same way that you do, which is very different than saying that you're right and I'm wrong. If the world looked to me this way, I'd probably feel the same way that you do. Now, if you can do just those 4 things at the beginning, avoid defending yourself and avoid defensiveness in the other person, if you can actively listen, that is, understand the situation from their perspective, get behind their eyeballs, if you can paraphrase back to them what they said and legitimize their point of view, the conflict that you will now be dealing with is fundamentally different than the conflict when that person came in. So what you're doing is you're completely changing what you have to manage. Then the next thing, another strategy you can use, is describing versus evaluating. If I go up to Jason here and I say, Jason, you are lazy. Am I describing or evaluating? Am I describing his behavior or evaluating his behavior? Yeah, I am evaluating his behavior. If, on the other hand, I say, Jason, you know, we had agreed to meet over in that room at 9 o'clock, and I was there till 9:30, and you never showed up. Am I now describing or evaluating? Describing. Okay, it's real important to describe, not evaluate. Or if I go up to Karen and I say, Karen, you have a bad attitude. What am I doing now? Describing or evaluating? Evaluating. Now, here's why this is so important. When you evaluate somebody, Karen, you've got a bad attitude, what is she going to change? Even if she wants to please me, what's she going to change? What's she going to change? Is she going to come in earlier, walk faster, smile more? I mean, what behavior is she going to change to make me happy? But if I say to her, Karen, you know, the other day when I asked you for help and you told me to jump in a lake, does she now know what the problem is? Okay, see, here's what happens. When we evaluate somebody else's behavior, Karen, you are lazy. Bam, they defend. They don't know what to change. They don't know how to handle the situation. So by evaluating her, I am creating defensiveness in her. By saying to her, Karen, the other day when I asked you for help and you told me to jump in a lake, now she knows what the problem is and we can talk about the problem. Now, here's why this evaluation versus description is so important. I got a call one day from the medical director of an HMO. And he's got these 2 people who are reporting to him who are responsible for pulling off a major project that, if they pull it off, will dramatically impact the bottom line of this HMO. But they've been in constant conflict, and this project has been going nowhere. So I interview them and work with them separately ahead of time, and we go over these strategies, and I actually drill them on this describe versus evaluate. So I bring them together, and I say to the first person, I said, okay, now tell her from your perspective what the problem is. And she says, you don't support me. What did she do? evaluate. I do all this work, and she still evaluates. The second person says, well, help me understand what it is I'm doing that looks to you like I don't support you. Okay, so here's what happened. She got an evaluation, so she asked for a description. So even in a conflict, if you get evaluated, what you can do is you can still manage it and change it by asking for the description of the behavior. So what the first person then said, well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you. When we're in meetings together and I bring up ideas, you don't say anything. And the second one said, oh my gosh, the reason we are such a great team is that you're the idea person and I'm the implementer. When we're sitting in meetings and you're bringing on one idea after another, I'm sitting there thinking, how would I implement that? How would I implement that? How would I implement that? And their conflict just went away. It evaporated, and it never came back because they went from evaluation to description. Because here's what happens otherwise. You don't respect me. Yes, I do respect you. No, you don't respect me. You never respect me. You cannot get out of this. You cannot get out of an evaluation. And that is why it is so important to always, in conflict, always describe the behavior that is a problem rather than to evaluate the behavior that's a problem. Now, another strategy that's extremely important in managing conflict is content versus relationship conflict. Now, let me explain the difference here. A content conflict is a conflict about some fact out in reality. You and I differ on what is the fastest way to get from this building to another point in town, so we each agree we'll get in our cars, and the first person who shows up there is the one who was right. That's a content conflict. Or you and I differ, Barbara, on what are the revenues for IBM last year. We agree that we'll get their annual report, and whatever it says in the annual report is the one who was right. That is a content conflict. The other type of conflict is a relationship conflict. I think you're trying to sabotage me. You're always trying to one-up me in meetings. You're always trying to make me look like a fool in front of the boss. Now, one of the most common reasons that conflicts don't get resolved is that when it comes to content or relationship, we do them on the wrong level. Now, let me give you an example of this. The fellow who told me this example was extremely proud of himself, which just amazed me. And here's what he said. He said the other night his wife was already in bed. And when he got in bed, his wife said to him, "Get out of this bed. I don't want you sleeping here." Now, my guess is it was a relationship conflict. Just a guess. His response to her was, "It's my bed. I bought the bed." Bumped it right up into a content issue. And unfortunately, she bit. And she said, "You did not buy the bed. Put it on a joint credit card." And they argued about how the bed was paid for. Now, this creates what I call déjà vu conflict. This conflict between this couple will keep coming back over and over and over again until they do it on the appropriate level. So what could she have done to get it back to the appropriate level? She might have said to him something like, "You know, it doesn't really matter to me how the bed was paid for. My issue is," fill in the blank, whatever her issue is. Now, let me give you the opposite. Let's say my colleague George comes into me, and George says, "Pat, I want to talk to you about that meeting yesterday. I think what you're recommending is going to take too long. It's going to cost too much. We can't possibly do it." And I say, "Are you angry with me? Why are you yelling at me like this? I thought we were friends." Now, can you see what I've done? What have I done? Yeah, well, yeah, What has happened is he has presented me with a nice, clean content conflict. And what I've done is I have bumped it into relationship. So now what George needs to do is to bump it back to the appropriate level. So what he might say to me is, "Pat, I really value you as a colleague. It's because I value you as a colleague so much that I want to talk to you about what you're recommending." Now, if you find yourself stuck in a conflict that just doesn't seem to go away, what I want you to look at is it a content conflict? Is it a relationship conflict? Or is it both? Because it can be both. And what happens if it's both is it's better to take care of the relationship part of the conflict first and then move into dealing with the content. And here's why. I bet you have all seen this situation where two people in a meeting together are disagreeing. And let's say that Jason and I are in this meeting together, And Jason thinks that A is the best way to do this project, and I think that B is the best way to do this project. But here's the problem. Jason is a jerk. I have never liked the guy. You never can trust him. So here, Jason and I are now in the meeting together, and we're arguing about whether A or B is the best way to do it, and I'm beginning to realize he's right. But am I going to give in? No, he's a jerk. And I bet you have all been in that meeting where the people now actually agree, but they continue to argue. And it's because the relationship part of the conflict was never dealt with, so the content can't be dealt with. And that's why, although it seems initially harder to deal with the relationship first and then the content, you will probably save time, because we can talk about this content problem till the cows come home. But if I don't trust you like you, Jason, it ain't ever going to get fixed up. Another strategy, in addition to describe versus evaluate, content versus relationship, is to focus on the future, not the past. So here's what happens. Bill and I are having this conflict about the stuff that I was supposed to get to him by 2 o'clock and I didn't get to him. What happens is, since we can't do anything about the past is dead and gone, we can't change it no matter what. What happens is people start to get defensive when we talk about the past. And again, our basic strategy is to avoid defensiveness. So now what I want to do is I want to flip it into the future. And so what I might do, going back to the example with Bill and the information at 2 o'clock, is I might say to Bill something like, okay, Bill, now, you know, I've done my avoiding defensiveness. I have done my actively listening. I paraphrased. I've legitimized. I said, okay, Bill, you know, what happened is I had every intent of getting this stuff to you, but the CEO called my boss, gave her a hot assignment. I was given that assignment, had to do it, and that's why I didn't get it to you. But here's what I'd like to do, Bill. I'd like to make a commitment to you, if this is okay with you, is I'd like to commit to you that in the future, when I say I'll do something for you, that if something comes up and gets in the way, that I will call you within, let's say, 10 minutes of finding out that I'm going to have a problem getting it to you. Would that be okay with you? Okay. Now, see, here's what I've done is I have now said, if this kind of situation comes up again, this is what I commit to do. Because we can't change the fact that he went to that meeting and felt like a fool. But what we can do is change the future. And people will often sort of, okay, settle down if they feel like they're not going to be facing this same kind of situation in the future. So that is focusing on the future and getting out of the past. Another big issue in terms of conflict is direct versus indirect communication. Let me give you an example of a couple. A couple's left on vacation this morning. They're driving along. He's driving. And it's getting towards noon. And she turns to him and says, "Are you hungry?" And he says, "No." Now, they've got a conflict and don't even know where it came from. So let's look at what happened here. What was her real message to him? Yeah, I'm hungry, stop this car right now. But she was brought up to be a lady, and ladies don't tell other people what to do. He, on the other hand, was brought up to be a direct kind of guy in situations like this. He reports on stomach status and continues to drive. Now, here's what happens. There is no problem. Would you hand me this cup, Bill? There is no problem when two direct people get together. Now, what's direct? Direct people say what they mean what they say, lay it on the line and tell it like it is. There's no problem, by the way, when two indirect people get together. Indirect people are more likely to bring up problems by hinting at them, suggesting at them, and asking questions about them. So there's no problem when we get together with somebody who's like us. Two directs get together. I don't like this cup. Well, what don't you like about it? Have no problem talking about the cup. There is no problem when two indirects get together. Oh, what do you think of this cup? Oh, I don't know. What do you think of the cup? They have no problem talking about the cup. The problem is when the direct and the indirect get together. So let me give you an example of this. I used to have a woman who worked for me who was highly, 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 highly indirect. And this had great potential for problems for us because I tend to be quite direct. In fact, I am very direct for a woman, and I often have to wear what I call my mental muzzle. Because if I just say what's in my brain and I don't wear my mental muzzle, I get called, yeah, you know what I get called, okay. So, but so we knew we had this difference, stylistic difference in terms of indirect and direct, and we talked about it a lot. But here's the problem. She would send me information indirectly, with indirect messages, and I wouldn't get them. They were like, not on my, you know this, not on my radio frequency. And then she'd get ticked off that I ignored it. No, so here's what I would do. I would observe her a lot to see how she sent these messages. And this is what I saw one day. She was talking to somebody who wanted her to go to a meeting in downtown LA. And she worked on the west side of LA, lived on the west side of LA, and did not like to leave the west side of LA. And she said to him, she said, you know, I get on the freeways, always get lost on the freeways, I probably never even get there. And he said, well, that's okay, because I'll send you a really good map. And she said, you know, I get downtown, I'm always going the wrong way on the one-way streets, I probably kill somebody. And he said, well, I'll just route you around the one-way streets. And she said, you know, I'm so busy right now, I'm not sure I could fit it in. And he said, well, I'll just meet with you whenever it's convenient. And after this interaction was over, I said to her, were you trying to tell him you didn't want to go downtown? And she said, yes, and he wasn't listening. Now, here's what I would bet from his perspective he saw, is this whiny woman. She comes up with a problem, I give her a solution, and she whines about another problem, when she thought she was being extremely clear to him about the fact that she didn't want to go downtown. So it's the interaction of these two styles. So what do you do if you got a direct and indirect? The best thing is to flex to the other style. Now, let me give you an example of what she and I did. And I'm going to be very upfront with you and tell you I felt phony doing this. It wasn't me. It didn't feel right. But here's the kind of thing that would happen. Here's my natural tendency. She's working on something, putting it together. And my natural tendency is to go up to her and say, I don't like the way this page is set up. Put this over here, put that down there, and put that in a different font. And when I talk like that, I could just see her hunker down. So here's what I learned to do. Oh, what an interesting way you've set up the page. What do you think about putting that down there? How about moving that over there? What do you think about putting a different font here? And I have to tell you, I did not feel sincere saying this, but what would happen is she could hear me when I said it. I mean, I really meant the message, but she could hear me. Now, bless her heart, on her side of things, you could see her getting wound up, physically wound up to get direct with me. Okay, Pat, I'm going to tell you exactly what I think. I'm just going to tell you exactly what I think. I don't like that. And I'd say, well, then change it. And she'd go, oh, wow, this really works, doesn't it? But this becomes a real problem in conflict. And what happens is, another component of this is that, well, there is a gender trend here, and that is that when it comes to telling other people what to do, women tend to be more indirect. Men tend to be indirect when it comes to talking about problems, weaknesses, errors, and emotions. So we both are direct and indirect. We are just direct and indirect at different times, and that creates even more conflict across the gender gap. Also, another component of this direct-indirect is the word why. Direct people ask the question why as a way of understanding the world. Indirect people ask the question why as a way of signaling a problem. Okay, let me give you an example of this. Get a call from a bank where I do work, and here's a scenario. The bank has a new chief operating officer. He is 6 months new to the bank, and he is new to banking. Reporting to him is the chief information officer. She has been at the bank for 10 years and done a fine job. But ever since he has shown up, they have been in constant conflict, and her performance has gone down the tubes. And they can't figure out why. They've actually tried talking about this, and they can't figure out why. So I meet with them separately ahead of time. And during my discussion with her, she tells me 3 times, I was raised by a Japanese mother. Now, I figure this must have something to do with the conflict. I haven't a clue what, though. So I bring them together, and here's what turns out was the problem. Ever since he had shown up on the job, he had been going around to her and to his other employees saying things like, why do you put out that report? Why do you do it that way? Why do you go to those meetings? And what she had been hearing was, screw up, screw up, screw up. And since everything she did was wrong, she did less and less and less. Now, what's going on here? From his perspective, his intent, being Mr. Direct here, his intent in asking these questions was to learn his job and the job of his employees. But she didn't hear it as an attempt to learn his job. She heard it as a message that she was doing the wrong stuff and doing it poorly. So what he had to learn, and which I have had to learn, because I love the question why. I mean, I've loved, and those of you who are direct, I bet you love the question. Ever since I was a kid, why is the sky blue? Why can't we do that? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but here's the problem. I know that indirect people will often hear it as a signal that they have done wrong. So what I have had to learn, and what he had to learn, was to say, help me understand. Help me understand the function of this report. Help me understand what happens at those meetings. And when he started doing that, she heard it for the intent behind it. Now, on her half, when he would slip and use the question, why, what she now does is she goes to him and says, are you telling me I did this wrong, or are you just a curious guy today? and since they have been able to do this, they've been able to manage, and they're doing just fine. Now, any guesses as to what the Japanese mother had to do with it? Any guesses? Here's what happened. Compared to our American culture, the Japanese culture is more indirect, or we're more direct than the Japanese culture. So for instance, if a business person goes over to Japan and wants the Japanese person to sign the contract, and the Japanese person does not like the contract, they won't say what a typical American would say is, buzz off, I'm not interested. They're much more likely to say, we need to study this further as a way of helping me save face and saying no in an appropriate way. And because of the difference in the cultures, she had learned to be more indirect from her mother as a result than we Americans tend to be. And that was what was driving the problem, is just the question why can create all kinds of conflicts. Now, let me share with you another kind of conflict that can be driven in terms of gender differences. And this is some research by Deborah Tannen. What she did is she looked at what happens with kids. She took little kids, medium-sized kids, bigger kids, and she sent them into a room where there were two chairs. She sent either two boys or two girls into the room where there were two chairs. When the girls would go in the room, they would turn the chairs facing each other and talk. When the boys would go in the room, they would turn the chairs facing the same direction, sort of lean, and talk. And at every age, they did the same thing. Now they grow up and get married. Do you see a problem? You see, the way that women do relationship is by talking about it. I love you, do you love me, will you love me forever, do you promise? To men, talk is cheap. It's the doing that counts. And last spring I was talking to a large group of physicians about this, and there was a couple there, both of them doctors, and I ran into her next time I was at that facility, and she said to me, I have been married for 17 years, and my husband has never said he's sorry, but he washes my car a lot. Now, here's what she was able to do, is she was able to read the message for the intent behind it. Because when we have conflict, we try to get it fixed up, we do it differently. Let me give you an example of, my husband and I were talking about this stuff one day, and right about that time we had gotten some new furniture, and it came with directions. You're supposed to get this fancy schmancy wax and put it on the furniture. And I was working the following Saturday, and I got home, and he had gone out and gotten the fancy wax, and he was waxing the furniture. Now, I have been married for 14 years, and I have never seen my husband in this activity. And he's waxing away, and then he starts waxing all the furniture in the room. And so I thought, well, he just got obsessed with this. And I went into the other room. And when he finished, he came in and he said, you see, I love you. In a million years, I would have never connected the waxing of the furniture with his feelings towards me. But this is a common problem in terms of communicating across the gender gap. Now, let me share with you, so what do? We got all these strategies. Here's a large strategy for you to use in terms of managing conflict, both in terms of preventing conflict, having a good relationship so that if you get into conflict, it's easier to manage. And it's called chip theory. Now, you may say, I've never heard of chip theory. That's because I made it up. Actually, it goes something like this. Imagine I'm walking into work one day, and I see Claudia out in the parking lot, and she says, "Hi, Pat, I haven't seen you in a long time. How you been?" "Fine." A couple days later, Claudia, you see me in the hallway at work. You say, "Hi, Pat, how you been?" "Fine." Now, if I continue to behave like this, what can we probably predict that Claudia will eventually do? Start ignoring me, because here's what happened. Claudia has given me a lot of attention, recognition, and caring. And I've given her virtually none in return. And I'm arbitrarily going to call this stuff that she's given me a lot of, and I've given her very little of, I'm arbitrarily going to call that stuff chips. And the way chips work is, we always make it equal in the end. And that's how you could pretty accurately predict that if I continue to behave this way, that Claudia would eventually start to ignore me. So one of the ways that we have, give, and get chips is through interaction with other people. Another way that we get chips is, to some degree or other, we are born with chips. If you are born with a name like Rockefeller, it will always be easier for you to get restaurant reservations than if you were born with a name like Heim. Because in our culture, we give a lot of chips to people who have that name. Now, what are some of the other chips that one can be born with? What are they? Beauty, absolutely. By the time a kid hits first grade, they get better or worse grades based on how cute or ugly they are. That's true. What other kinds of chips can people be born with? Right? Smarts, the intelligence, absolutely. Innate skills, mathematical skills, musical skills, athletic skills. To some degree or other, we are born with chips. And the third way that we have chips in life is, as we go through life, we can actively acquire chips. Now, what are some of the chips you can actively acquire? What are they? You can marry chips. You thought you married for love? You married for chips. You bet. And we'll even talk about it. We'll say, well, why in the heck do you suppose she's marrying him? What we're saying is, what chips does he bring to this party, huh? Well, is this not true? Other kinds of chips that you can get education, you can get titles. I am a vice president, you know. Those are all chips that skills, knowledge, ability, those are chips you can actively acquire. Now, here's the component in terms of managing chips. One of my basic premises in terms of managing chips is everybody is an accountant. They may be an engineer, a nurse, or whatever, but they're also an accountant in that they keep a bank book on you. And all day long, you are gaining chips and losing chips, gaining chips and losing chips. And they know exactly where you stand with them at any moment. Second premise in terms of managing chips is the issue of supply and demand. Now, let me give you an example of the supply and demand issue. A million years ago, I used to be a university professor. And we had a department secretary named Loretta. And Loretta worked in a windowless cubicle all by herself all day long. And the chips in life that Loretta really valued were interaction chips. Oh, you go in there to get something. She'd say, oh, talk to me, please, talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. And when I would go in her little cubicle, I'd pay her interaction chips. How are you? Got your haircut? Looks really nice. What's happening around the department? And one day I was in my boss's office working with my boss, and Loretta came in and left to bring me some typing. And when she left, the boss said, when did you give her that typing? I said, well, this morning. Does she always bring it when she's done? I said, well, yeah, usually. I gave her typing 3 days ago, and she never brings it when she's done. Well, the boss did not pay Loretta her interaction chips. And we always make it equal in the end. Now, the reason I talk about that in terms of supply and demand is I went from working in that environment to working in an environment populated primarily by engineers. And one of the things I quickly learned is if you throw a lot of interaction at an engineer, it can cost you chips. So here's the thing about chips. You need to know that what Jason values may be different. The kinds of chips that Jason values may be different than the kind of chips that Karen values versus the kind of chip that Katia values. Because if I just give them the chips that work for me, I will often miss the boat. Third thing in terms of managing chips is one of the things you want to do is build up a surplus account with people. Because if you have a surplus account with people, they will be there when you need them. And for me, the best example I can think of a surplus account is if you think of the best boss you have ever had in your life. I want you to get a mental picture of who that boss is. Best boss you've ever had in your life. That is somebody who had a surplus account with you. If they needed something, you did it. It didn't matter if it was part of your job description, what you felt like doing, whether it was convenient. You just did it anyway. Because, therefore, what you want to do is, for those people that either you're likely to get into conflict with around the organization because of the situation that the two of you working together, or just being able to get things done, you want to build up surplus accounts with people. You've all probably known somebody in the organization who can get anything done overnight without having to go through the official channels of having it signed in triplicate. That's because that person has chips buried everywhere. Because if you do not have a surplus account, you will find yourself in chip deficit. I always warn my husband when he's getting dangerously close to chip deficit. Because even the most boring individual can become a creative genius when it comes to making it equal in the end. Now, let me ask you, what kinds of things have you seen people do to make it equal in the end? What kinds of things have you seen? Forget, didn't I tell you the CEO called you? I could have sworn I told you. Yeah, What are the kinds of things have you seen people do to make it equal in the end? What have you seen? Come on. Delay? I'm working so hard. You know, if you push me more, I have to go out stress leave, huh? Yes. Or have you ever seen this one? They do exactly what you say. Have you seen this one? Yeah. All right. Let me give you an example of this. This was told to me by the perpetrator. And when he told me, at that point in his life, he was a probation officer, but when it happened, he was in the Navy. And he was on a ship. And the captain of this ship was in heavy chip deficit with everybody on the ship. The propeller was broken. As you know, propellers are very important things on ships. They had taken the propeller out, put it on the top deck. They were working on it there. The captain came by, did not like it being in the way, and said, "Get rid of it." They threw it in the ocean. We always make it equal in the end. Now, I have known managers, for instance, who will say, they have to do what I say. I'm the boss. Well, yeah, they'll do what you say, but somehow, some way, someday, they'll always make it equal in the end. Let me give you an example of a manager who did not understand this. His name was John, and John was hired into a company where I worked. His office was next to mine, although our functions were not related. And John was hired in to manage a group of people who had to travel a great deal, not to the garden spots of America, but real pit places, in my opinion. And John managed a group of people, this group of people who traveled a lot. And in this company, you were allowed what was called a safe arrival call. That is, when you travel on company business, you could call home and say, "Honey, I got here and the company paid for it." And apparently, and I didn't even know this, apparently there was a $1 limit on this safe arrival call. Well, John starts his job, and he realizes that his new employees have been spending over their limit on their safe arrival call. And John, to, I suppose, impress the people upstairs, decides he's going to collect the money they owe. You owe me $3.72. You owe me $8.16. And you, big talker, you owe me $11.75. Now, in my opinion, John's group was not a particularly high-energy group prior to this. But suddenly you could walk through the area and feel the energy. The team building that occurred was phenomenal. And what was the team's agenda? Get John. Anything you can do, get John. And from that point on, what would happen is the wrong person would show up with the wrong equipment to do the wrong job. He'd get that fixed up and fall apart over there. He'd get that fixed up and fall apart over there. And the problem was that John was trying to fix these parts and pieces, but the problem was that John didn't understand chips. And therefore, in conflict, you are going to, A, be able to avoid conflict if I have a chip surplus with you. I'm much more likely to avoid it. And if we get into conflict, I'm going to be able to manage it more effectively because of that chip surplus. Otherwise, if you find yourself in chip deficit, you will be getting into conflict with that person a tremendous amount. Now, those are some of the strategies and tactics in terms of managing conflict. I want to point out as we move towards the barn here that conflict is rarely comfortable. I've never had anybody say, "Oh, I just love to get into conflict with other people." But what happens is, if we can manage it well, we can actually end up with a better relationship with this person. Actually, as I said, feel more cohesive with this person than I did before. But we've got to manage it well. So in terms of the keys, in terms of managing conflict, you want to avoid defensiveness. Avoid defensiveness on your part and avoiding defensiveness on the part of the other person. You want to also step back and strategize. Rather than just responding to the person the way you've always responded, step back and strategize and think about some of the tactics that we've talked about. Zipping the lip and listen, paraphrasing, legitimizing, describing instead of evaluating, making sure I'm doing it on the right level in terms of content versus relationship, focusing on the future, not drumming about the past. Also making sure that in terms of direct and indirect, I'm flexing how we can best talk about conflict. And chips. Don't forget, we always make it equal in the end. Thank you very much.
Great.
When the girls would go in the room, they would turn the chairs facing each other and talk. When the boys would go in the room, they would turn the chairs facing the same direction, sort of lean, and talk. And at every age, they did the same thing. Now they grow up and get married. Do you see a problem?